Live from the sun-drenched cobblestones of the Eternal City, conversation crossing faith, culture, and current events. Civil discourse, civil debate, and the free exchange of ideas. This is Intersections with Bree Dail and Matt Dooley. Now your hosts, Bree and Matt.
And good morning from Naples, Italy. I am on the road right now. This is all new Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events with Bree Dail and Matt Dooley. For those of you who are joining us from the first time, I am an internationally accredited journalist, including accreditation to the Holy See as the Rome correspondent for the Epoch Times. You may also find me in Catholic World Report, and I have contributed to National Catholic Register and other outlets. I hold a BA in History from Christendom College and a master's degree in Foreign Policy and Diplomacy from the prestigious Norwich University. And I am blessed to be joined by my co-host, Colonel Matthew Dooley, U.S. Army retired. Matt, it is a privilege as always.
Happy to be here, Bree.
So Matt, so that the listeners hear and everybody will hear in the background like a little bit of noise because I'm actually in Naples in an undisclosed area. Actually, no, I'm at the Naval Exchange in Naples right now. But for our listeners for the first time, if you could introduce yourself again, you are an Army officer with a certain set of skills, Matt.
Yeah, I don't do a good Liam Neeson impersonation, but my skill sets come from graduating from West Point in 1994. I was commissioned a second lieutenant in armor, and so I spent the majority of my career in armor and cavalry formations. I have a Bachelor of Science in military history with a minor in systems engineering. So that, you know, my initial education has a very broad background in both engineering and the hard sciences, as well as a deep understanding of history. I also have a master's of military art and science that I got from the Commanding General Staff College. And so my perspectives are both technical as well as historical.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about some of your technical SME. I think some people are going to really want to stay tuned for the last part of the show because we're going to be talking about advanced robotics. And I know that people are interested in what's on the tip of the spear, so to speak, in both the military sense and is coming down the pipe to schools near you. But before we get there, what we do here at the show is we try to break this down into three parts. One is a focus on what's going on in the church, in the Vatican. And then from there, we talk about what's going on in the world and in politics and policy. And then we talk about culture and how that's all connected in our intersection. So the first section here, we're going to talk a little bit about an update on the health status of Cardinal Perth and some, words to the wise of those who are listening and watching, hoping to hear information about Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke's health, as we know he has COVID. And then going into our second part of the show and the bulk of the show today, we're going to be talking about what is happening in Afghanistan. I'm sure you all are going to want to hear from a veteran of the war. Both of us are veterans, but I served on board ships, so I wasn't in the dirt, so to speak, but Matthew was. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and then talk a little bit about the political and international repercussions and what we're seeing in a vacuum. And then some personal stories, hopefully, as well, on some of the interpreters that we have been working with getting them out around the system. And then finally, like I said, we're going to talk about robotics, and Elon Musk is in the news again. So, Matt, just a kind of quick update on Cardinal Raymond Leo Burke, who comes from Wisconsin. And we really love him here in Rome. He is definitely considered a conservative in the realm of political speak in the church, but he is very orthodox, likes to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, is a canon lawyer, was the top canon lawyer in Rome for some time before he was removed from that position by this current Pope Francis. But what's interesting about him is that he has been a big proponent on the use of reason and, your own judgment on receiving the current vaccinations. He is not anti-vax, and I think people really need to be aware that he has never come out and said anything anti-vax, but he is against the use, the medical use of, aborted fetus cell lines in vaccinations. And not all the vaccines right now in the COVID vaccinations do that. So please be aware that it's a lot more complicated than what it seems to be. But ever since he was diagnosed with COVID, and he has it pretty bad, Matt, there has been a lot of politicking from both the left and the right in the church. And we've seen in both left and right media the manipulation of his sickness for their own propaganda. So the left has said, well, see, he is anti-vax and therefore he has COVID. And there has been rejoicing at his sickness. I mean, he has been on a ventilator until this most recent update on his health. And then I've seen on the right, Matt, individuals saying, well, he is anti-vax and we love him for that. He is the martyr of anti-vax, propaganda. And that's not the case either. He's not a martyr of the vaccine of COVID. So there's a lot of politicking and where, I think there should be praying for a man who's really beloved in the church. But Matt, like recently, and I think this will be something that you will take to notice, his family came out with a health status update through the Guadalupe Shrine and his social media platforms that he has, stating last week that he was on a ventilator, that he was fairly ill, but he was in the ICU and he was stable, but he was critical. I mean, it was very serious but stable. And this was because there was disinformation being pushed that the doctors gave him 48 hours. I heard another disinformation in a video program interview that his family was not able to see him. The doctors were keeping them away. All of this nonsense that was being pushed out, which was, it was pushed back by the family, Matt. The family said, stop with all of this. Do not report anything else unless it comes directly from these sources. And we're going to only provide updates sparingly. Please respect us, respect our decision. And then it was like 48 hours and new disinformation, positive this time, saying that he was out of the ICU, he was no longer on a vent, all of these things he was doing very well, came out through two individuals in the Catholic right, despite the fact that the family asked to respect their privacy and that they would provide updates when they had them. So Matt, what are we seeing here before we go on? Like, what is this type of polarized lack of respect? Is it because of clicks? Is this what it is? Is like to try to make the clicks to get sponsorship? Why do you think both the left and the right are using this particular man's illness as kind of a jumping off point for disinformation, if that's the case?
Bree, I think you've got to ask yourself the question, who stands to benefit from a contentious conversation about Cardinal Burke and the vaccines against COVID in general, and why? I've often said that morality without science is silly because you're ignoring the common sense tools that God gave you. But to move towards science without morality risks something far worse. And that's really what we're talking about here. You can see time and time again where we've made decisions globally with science in mind without considering the long-term consequences and the moral implications. To be more specific, the idea of using fetal tissue, the questions of eugenics, the questions of putting people to sleep and calling it some euphemism like euthanasia. There are all kinds of things you can do scientifically that for moral reasons should bear a moment of pause.
Right.
There are a number of people out there who have very valid scientific concerns about the nature of certain vaccines. And though I am vaccinated, I accepted the calculus in that I was accepting some risk in order to be safe, that this is not a completely approved, completely vetted vaccine, but we moved it forward because of emergency conditions. And you should respect people who have some concerns about that. For those who choose to get vaccinated, most of us are doing this because it's necessary to get on an airplane or to have a job in a certain location. It's not because we're a wholesale advocate and we've swallowed the pill that says, okay, this is going to be completely safe. I recognize as a soldier, especially, that years from now, there may be unintended consequences. I've been shot up with all kinds of things from anthrax, vaccinations and everything else. God only knows what's inside me and what may happen another 5 or 10 years from now. So I'm no stranger to the need to have a vaccine for something, because I have to go somewhere and perform a mission. And so when you look at the intersection between the different arguments here, there are all kinds of reasons and justifications for it that are outside of human health, for political exploitation, for business exploitation. And that's what I have a problem with.
And I think that's why I would say, like, going back and taking a look at like what's going on with Cardinal Burke's health, I can't help but notice the similarities of the use of crisis for pushing out a narrative. And I think we have to be really careful about that in a time of emotional reactionaries, to like step back and say, hey, we have the right to question, but to do it in such a reasonable way that we're using that's one of the things as Catholics that we pride ourselves in, is that we recognize that the demonic, the world, the flesh, and the devil have the ability to manipulate us in our emotions or our lower faculties, and that we have our higher faculties, our intellect and our free will, that can make decisions rationally. And I would say that people just need to listen and hear. And I think put yourself in the position of the family of Cardinal Burke and say, look, like he's ill. He is conscious. He is asking his family to support him. His family has said, look, you don't need to know everything at any time about his health status, but we ask that you respect our decision to only use one particular source of communication, and that way there is no disinformation. I think we have to respect that, and then you have to ask yourself why, if it's not respected, why, if there are people, whether people that you like, right or left, why those individuals are not respecting that. Is that because they have an agenda? You have to start asking yourself, what is the point for this? Because we definitely see on both sides of the house that this is a touchy subject, right? And so, Matt, talking about touchy subjects, when we get back, we're going to be talking about the politics of the withdrawal and some of the things that we've been hearing from our president, and things that we're hearing on the ground, and experiences that you and I have had this past week in getting in touch with people who are American citizens, or people with, the special visa that allows them to come to the United States because they were interpreters and saved many of our men and women on the ground. And this is a touchy subject, because the question remains for those of us who have served, we go and we fight because we're ordered to do so. But for many people, this is a war that we should never have gotten ourselves into. So, Matt, before we go to break, which we have about a minute, what are your thoughts as we move on to break about what we saw with the president yesterday? And we have 50 seconds.
Yeah, I think before we get into break, it's important to lead off with the idea that some things have to be done. Some wars have to be fought. And it's important to remember exactly why we ended up in Afghanistan, because it's 20 years later, we're almost a generation removed. We went there because we had to respond to what happened on September 11th, 2001. The Taliban, who were in charge, allowed a terrible ideology to metastasize inside their country, and it got outside their borders and attacked us. We got to remember that.
We'll be back shortly.
Have you ever dialogued with someone who espouses relativism, which says there is no truth, or it might be true for you, but not for me? It's pretty frustrating. Deep down, we know these claims are false, but we often don't know why. Here's the reason. To say there is no truth is a contradiction. The assertion is tantamount to saying it's true that there is no truth. Plain absurdity. Now, the other position, there is no absolute truth, just truth relative to the individual set of beliefs, is problematic as well. The usage of the verb is implies an assertion about the objective order of things. It's the same thing as saying it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth, which of course is a contradiction. No matter how the relativist slices the pie, he ends up with a contradiction, making relativism an unreasonable worldview. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
We all know children have a natural innocence and a sense of wonder. Yet our world is full of distractions that can pull families in the wrong direction. But with the help of God and a church family, your children can grow in the security of faith, hope, and love. Weekly Mass provides that critical faith foundation needed in life. So if your family hasn't been to Mass in a while, we'd like to invite you home. Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.org.
And welcome back to an all-new Intersections Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events. This is Bree Dail, and I'm with Colonel Matthew Dewey. And in our first section, we were discussing, really focused on Cardinal Burke and his health update. His health is improving, and that's an amazing miracle, and we should be continuing to pray. And I will keep everyone updated when the family chooses to give an update. As soon as possible, I put it out on my social media, so follow me on social media. Now, Matt, before we begin talking about this next segment, do you have a social media account that you want people to follow you on?
Well, I've since gotten off of Twitter, but I'm debating whether or not I stand that back up again. In the end, I, like many others, had to take a stand against some of the big tech censorship. So more to be seen on that front.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. And I think a lot of people feel the very same way, and right now are being torn as well. Like, do we come back? Do we try to continue on the conversation now that it's post-election? And I really would encourage a lot of people to consider coming back on and joining the fight in a logical and civil way. But speaking about logical and civil, two things that this next topic is likely not. We're going to be talking about what has been going on here in Europe for the past few weeks, which are continued protests throughout Europe, not really being covered too much on the mainstream media, but protests in Europe against what is known as the Green Pass. Now, right now in Italy, we have something called a Green Pass, which is an identifier of those who have received either a vaccine or who have received a quick test within 48 hours for COVID. And, a lot of people call this a vaccine passport. And reality is it's not yet affected mass transit, but it will be, Matt. And September 1st, supposedly, there will be new laws enforced throughout Europe that are going to cause it very difficult for people who do not hold the Green Pass, who have not yet been tested within the 48 hours, or who do not have a vaccine against COVID to use mass transit. So before we get into the Afghanistan, sorry, my apologies, the Afghan withdrawal, what are your thoughts on this pass? Because I know that there's conversation about standing something very similar up in Washington, D.C. And in case that's not enough, we're also hearing that there's a potential travel lockdown that could occur from Europe and other places that are considered hot spots for the new Delta virus variants. What are your thoughts, Matt?
I think there are two elements here. The first one I mentioned before is the normal human tendency to pursue freedom. Folks are incredibly instinctive about overreach, government overreach, and things that are unnecessary. And I think you're seeing a lot of pushback against, why do I have to have a card? I'm entitled to freedom of speech and freedom of movement. And it's not just an American idea. You see it in Europe. Europe, especially Western Europeans, enjoy their freedom. And now you've got Eastern Europeans who remember what it was like to live under communism. And they're some of the strongest advocates for things that we used to fight for.
Right.
So that's a lot of the churn that you're seeing in people pushing back. The other question is, then what does this lead to? If you can force me to have a pass, an Ausweis, a card, or something I wear on my jacket that allows me to move back and forth, what else can you make me do?
Right.
And I'm not a conspiracy theorist to ask you that question, particularly if I'm a European, because we've got recent history in the last century about restrictive governments doing things to people. So
Right.
I have to respect the protesters for their concern. From an economic perspective, what are we going to do for tourism? If you're a European in some of the cities, you may like the idea of not having tourists flooding your areas, but economically, there's a long-term consequence for restricting movement for people who can't come into your country or have to be quarantined for 2 weeks to be able to move, to be able to even get out of their hotel. So they're going to answer this question.
A massive economic depletion in the Italian economy, to a point where if there is another shutdown, which people are talking about that potential in fall, the likelihood for an economic recovery is very low. All economists are saying it because the majority of the economy of Italy is based off of tourism. From what I've been told, the Vatican also, same thing, Vatican has had 5% of what the original tourists, the 100% that's usually here, and they're down to only 5% this year. So that speaks to just the massive deficit that has taken place. And it's felt, Matt, like you go throughout the Vatican and you don't even see the crowds at the Sunday Angelus, which is, out in the open. So, and there is no, green pass requirement for that. So yeah, it's an ongoing question. And one thing that I think would be just like a logical deduction in this is to sit down and say, okay, we know that reports out of the CDC say that the current vaccine is, the vaccines that are out there may end up having to have a booster because of the Delta variant breakthroughs. We're seeing that, right? So if the vaccine is not working to the level that they're saying it should be, then a green pass, what's the point? Because the vaccine is not working, not protecting. But if it is working, then what's the point of having a green pass? Because it's working. And so those who are not vaccinated are going to cause those who are vaccinated to be sick. So I think there is a question to whether or not even the term vaccine should be used in this case versus therapy, because the vaccine itself is not what we consider a vaccine, i.e. you create an immunity against this virus. You'll never get it. And they have said it from the get-go. Like the medical community has not lied about that. They have said that this is not going to make you completely, foolproof against any type of variant in the future.
Well, there you go, injecting science into it, Bree. I mean, that's I think the frustration here is we have, as a population, a dependency on the experts. We want to be able to talk to and listen to the scientists, the doctors who say, do this, don't do that, and here's why. But we've had so many different reversals and conflicting viewpoints. It's not misinformation, it's contradictory information. If you're dependent on a guy like Dr.
It's
Fauci.
normal. But it's normal in the area of science, though, to have developments of science. I think one of the things that people need to realize is that, in this type of medical science, especially with a virus that looks to have been manipulated, we don't know what we don't know, and neither do the scientists who are watching this. And so I think we have to be really careful with the scientists, but I think it's also the scientists need to be very careful about standing up and firm and claiming that they have all the answers if they don't know. It is better to say you don't know at this point, and that we're trying these therapies to ensure that there isn't a more of a manipulation of the virus that is deadly. I mean, it's a very serious virus if you get it to the point where you are intubated in a hospital ward. So I think we have to be really careful with the emotional manipulation that has happened because of fear. But speaking of that, Matt, and we're going to go on to this because I concur with you. Like I stand with those who protest in the name of freedom to say, hey, we don't want to have any enforcement of something. We want to be able to choose. Matt and I have had a lot of vaccines, and the shots that I've had have caused my body to react in such a way that I have an autoimmune disease from the military, and I can deal with it. But I'm not sure if I would want that if I had a choice or knew that could be a possibility. If I would have accepted those vaccines, I may have elected to leave the military. Who knows at this point? But we'll never know. And I think that that's the point. We're seeing that also in the military right now, where the government is saying that, those who are active duty are going to have to receive the vaccine. And there are people who are now making the decision to leave the military because of that. And that should be their right. It should be the right to decide whether or not you get something that's still very much in study injected into your body. And just like you said, you had the vaccine. I've chosen not to get it, but I might. I look at the Congregation of the Doctrine and Faith's arguments on the validity of the use of certain vaccines, and going against some of the use of the vaccines as well. Certain vaccines that are used made with the HEK cell line, and I think both sides make very reasonable arguments. But speaking of both sides and also arguments, what we're seeing right now is a withdrawal, Matt. And can you kind of walk through, for people who don't really understand, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, made the decision that we were not going to maintain course and speed with, keeping military presence in Afghanistan, correct? It was not supposed to be long-term. But our president back then did not make a decision on the timeline or give out a date. But President Biden did. And he gave that date back in April as August 31st. So can you explain to people why that might have been the wrong decision and what may have led to why we're seeing the reaction from the Taliban?
I think to get directly after your question, the last thing you want to do in telling an opposing force is your exact plan and your exact timeline, because then you give them the ability to plan a counteraction or a very dangerous course of action based on what they know about your plan. However, I do want to be fair to the current administration, at least in this respect, in that we were always going to leave Afghanistan, that the outcome was always going to be decided by Afghans. But here's where I deviate from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. There was a plan to disengage that was created by the previous administration that made sense, milestones and metrics that would then lead to follow-on decisions as we gradually drew down. And the Afghan National Army and the Afghan government understood that plan, and were beginning to make their plans about how to gradually step up as we drew down. But what this current administration did is the equivalent of walking over and jerking the computer out of the wall. Anybody that knows anything about shutting down a complex system knows you have to do it in stages. It has to be phased. If you crash it, then you end up with what we've seen the last 2 weeks. And that's frustrating. And as a veteran, there are two schools of thought, two feelings that I have that I hear echoed most often in my peers. Is one is frustration in the inability of the Afghan National Army to step up and fight, and the government to stand up for themselves. However, there's the understanding that they thought they were going to have close air support. They thought they were going to have contract support, and it's an absolute morale kick, a punch in the gut. When the people that you've depended on for the last decade or so, since we killed bin Laden, who promised you they'd be there to support you, suddenly aren't there and leave in the middle of the night. And so do we expect them to do that to them? That's a concern. The other thing I'm hearing is,
if I can break in real quick, I think it's also really important for people to be aware that our allies are feeling that same gut punch. And we know this because within the last week, we have had ally after ally who currently, from what we're hearing on the ground, the Brits, the French are going out and doing snatch and grabs of, their people in Afghanistan and bringing them into safety of the airport and flying them out. They wouldn't have had to do that if there was a coordinated drawdown, but it doesn't seem to have been the case, to the point where we had, a veteran of this war and now a member of parliament stand up and make this incredibly moving speech and saying in part that what has happened in this administration has been shameful. That was the term that he said. It's shameful. And it led to the parliament putting out a vote of no confidence against the president of the United States. I don't know if that's ever happened. Has that ever happened in the history of, obviously we've been a very close ally with the Brits since, the War of Independence, but have you ever heard of, the parliament coming out and putting out a vote of no confidence?
Yeah, basically holding the president of the United States in contempt. I do believe they held us in contempt at the breakout of the revolution. But yeah, I don't think there's anything like that since. It's an echo return of a sense of moral responsibility. There are things that we have to accept that the conditions on the ground are difficult, and that the transition out of Afghanistan was always going to be challenging. But there's a way you do things, and this isn't it. And so let us accept the fact that things have slid a bit sideways, and not make it worse by failing to understand that we now have to take active measures to repair. We can turn this around. Just because something bad happens doesn't mean that you have to permit a cascade of follow-on worse actions. And there used to be a time when we recognized we were the United States of America, and we didn't stand for chaos like this. And there's still time to turn this around.
Yeah, we need to stop the bloodletting, so to speak. Things are chaos right now. We've seen, pictures and videos of children being handed over to our Marine Corps brethren over barbed wire in order to get the kids out of danger, immediate danger, because there's live fire taking place at people, these crowds in front of the airport. Now I'm going to ask Adrian to pull up a video that I posted. It is our president addressing members of the White House Correspondents' Corps when he was asked a question on a recent yesterday, I believe the poll came out yesterday, of Americans having lost confidence in his leadership. Adrian, if you could play that, please.
Poll also found that, based in part on what's transpired in the last week, the majority of Americans, forgive me, I'm just the messenger, no longer consider you to be competent, focused, or effective at the job.
I haven't seen that poll.
It's out there from CBS this morning. What would you say to those Americans who no longer believe that you can do the job?
I had a basic decision to make. I either withdraw America from a 20-year war that, depending on whose analysis you accept, cost us $150 million a day for 20 years or $300 million a day for 20 years, I carry this card to me every day, and who, in fact, where we lost 2,448 Americans dead and 20,722 wounded.
Poll also found that, based in part on what's transpired in the last week, the majority of Americans, forgive me, I'm just the messenger, no longer consider you to be competent, focused.
Okay, so we heard that question again. Thanks, Adrian, for pulling that up. But he later on, and we do have a video of that, but he doesn't need to play that. Adrian, you don't have to play that. But we do have a video later on where the president of the United States says that he believes that in history's hindsight, this action of withdrawal that he has overseen, that he has said that the buck stops with him. This, as you said, like the pulling out of the computer against the wall. that's on him. He believes that in hindsight, the history will look at that he made the right decision, he made the right call. You know, one of the things that really caused me as a veteran real frustration, especially as we'll talk about this in a moment, you know, we are literally dealing with people on the ground, you and I both, and then, you know, many of our brothers have been doing the same, trying to work workarounds in order to save the men and women who have supported us while we're on the ground. You know, what really made me frustrated at that is that he pulls out a card in answer to a poll that was asked about his leadership. He pulls out a card and names the 2,000 plus dead and 20,000 plus injured from Afghanistan. And I have to say, like, he's saying, well, we have to end this, and I get that, but he was also vice president during the majority of those who were injured, and it just makes me upset on that to see him using our men and women and saying this is the reason why we had to pull out the way we did. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's there's a couple of thoughts I have. The first one is when you're asked a question, and it's a statistic from the views of the American people, particularly when it comes to combat loss and the situation we're in. The first thing you don't do is laugh. The second bad optic is pulling that card out of your jacket because you don't have a mastery of the facts for which you were responsible for the last decade. Those two things right there, as a former senior leader in the military accountable for my actions and decisions, speaking to another senior leader who happens to be my president, that's bad, sir. And you ought to really consider about the next time you're asked a question like that, the optics of how you handle it and how you answer it. Second question, or second issue, second response. For those who are working to make things happen on the ground, we do recognize that we were going to leave Afghanistan. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Everyone, the US military, NATO, recognized that we were going to exit. But there's a style of way you leave. If you're taking your family out of Disneyland and headed to the parking lot, you don't leave things behind, you don't leave kids behind, and you don't dash into the vehicle and drive off into the night without accounting for everything in accordance with your exit plan. I'm not seeing a whole heck of a lot of that out of this administration. I am aware of folks inside the Pentagon, senior leaders, and folks on the ground, both contract and military, who are doing everything they can humanly possible to make a better situation out of a bad situation. And I want to give credit to those men and women who are doing it now, doing things that we'll only hear about later. Because we don't have a classified forum on this show to talk about some of the things that are going on actively on the top secret side. I'm confident that folks are stepping up and trying to make a difference. But we're certainly not showing that to the world when we're laughing when reporters are asking questions.
Yeah, and Matt, you know, like you and I have had this conversation this week because I've been very, very upset being contacted by, you know, here I am overseas right now in Naples, but mostly in Rome, being contacted by my brothers over in you know, either in the dirt or those who are in the United States, possibly getting ready to deploy. And here they are contacting me and saying, look, I've got a Terp, that's what we call them, interpreters. I've got a Terp that saved my guys, like saved my butt in the dirt over there. And he has been contacting me via cell phone saying, I'm stuck in the airport and the Taliban is shooting some of our Terps. And we've heard some of these horrific stories already of, you know, individuals who supported our military being drug out in the streets and shot. I heard of one Terp who, you know, I can't verify this, but one individual who served with this guy said his entire family was killed, and this guy was like his arms were cut off, and his military ID, his military, like his, you know, helping with the U.S. military, you get an ID that was melted into his chest. And that you and I have been working on trying to get some of these guys out, and I won't name the Terp because he's still in process, but one of my Marine Corps friends was able to get this guy out of country because of and I'm not gonna name the individual working at the embassy here, but the embassies here in Italy, both for the Vatican as well as the Italian, the U.S. embassy to Italy and to the Vatican, both have been working nonstop because people are contacting all of our enemies, trying to, not our enemies, our embassies, trying to get our people out, people who've been on lists for special visa access for over 2 years. Nat, we have 3 minutes for this section, but I would love to hear your experience on some of what you've experienced with in the last week.
Yeah, Bree, it's been more of what you're talking about, anecdote after anecdote, of story after story of those who were either U.S. citizens who had Afghan family, or former interpreters, or those who were in the ANA or the government who were trying to find a way through Kabul airport. And it's the same thing, very similar to your story. It's a question of folks rolling up their sleeves and getting after the problem, making phone calls, using encrypted apps, talking to embassies, talking to folks on the ground, either finding a government way out or a contract flight on the way out. A lot of discussion about the methodologies behind what each of the countries are doing in their approach. Certainly the Brits in Second Para have gotten several stories out there about them going out and grabbing people. The French equivalent of their special forces going out and grabbing others. And then I think the rules about what the American soldiers on the ground are permitted to do have changed and ebbed and flowed. There's also been stories about, the control over the gates and when they allow folks through. What I do know, and what you can find in open source, is that getting out of Afghanistan is just but one step. That there are a number of countries that are taking some of these refugees and holding them at their locations while we figure out what to do next. And that's the state of play as we understand it over the last week or so.
And Matt, with this minute left, I just want to tell those who are listening to us, this is not how we work in the military. We are systematic. We don't believe in chaos, but we do believe in adapt and overcome. That is what our men and women are doing in the armed forces right now to try to support this ongoing, very, very hot area as we see this, as well as those in the Department of State. So our hats are off to our brothers and sisters who are serving in these different capacities. And when we return, we're going to talk a little bit about technology and the advancement of technology, robotics. Thanks for joining us. This is Intersections, Crossing Faith, Culture, and Current Events.
Among the many arguments relativists give to prove their worldview, one is that moral beliefs change. For example, they might say, we used to believe slavery was okay, but now we don't. If there were moral absolutes, well then moral beliefs wouldn't change. How do we respond? Well, we can ask the relativists if we've morally progressed in changing our country's slavery laws. Assuming they say yes, we can point out the fact that progress implies an objective moral standard that our society better conforms to today than it did 150 plus years ago. But if there's an objective moral standard that we've progressed toward, well then morality is not relative. So the relativist either has to give up on the idea that we've progressed morally in order to keep relativism, or reject relativism to keep the idea of moral progress. I'm Carlo Broussard with a ready reason for Catholic Answers, Catholic.com.
Years ago, when I started acting, modeling, and singing in Mexico, my Catholic faith was not the center of my life. It took me many years to discover that success, fame, money, and all the pleasures of the world were not going to fulfill me. I got to a point in my life where I thought I had everything, but I realized something was missing. Thankfully, I began a faith journey that brought me back to God and home to the Catholic Church. You can too.
Discover more at CatholicsComeHome.com.
And welcome back to Intersections. This is Bree Dail. I'm joined with my co-host, Colonel Matthew Dooley. And this is our last segment where we like to talk a little bit about culture, some current events that you may not have heard about in the news. But before we get to that, Matt, I just wanted to kind of do some shout outs to some of the individuals who are listening to us today. Leonard says he'd like us to talk more about the intersections of mass vaccinations and worldwide refugee resettlement. I think that would be an interesting conversation for us to have next week, Matt, because, we're talking about, citizens receiving vaccinations, but what about displaced persons? What about persons without the status of, citizenship? Who takes care of them? And should they be vaccinated? Should they not be vaccinated? These conversations are having. And, one of the things that I've seen coming out of our mass media is that, with the upstart of what's gone on in Afghanistan, I think it was CNN reported about, vaccinations dropping in Afghanistan. Thinking to myself, I think in the realm of like cost benefit analysis right now, I think people staying alive is probably, from getting shot by the Taliban is probably more up on the top of the list than trying to get a vaccine. But thanks, Leonard. We're gonna talk about that. I think it would be something that we'd like to talk about more. And then, Jesus Moreno, thank you very much for saying that you love the show. Please tell people to listen in and give us feedback. We really appreciate that. And Colin, thank you very much for your support of the troops. Yes, God bless them, and thank you for your support of us. It gives us the ability and the motivation to continue to serve. So Matt, this is one of the really exciting times in technology that when I saw this story, I was just thrilled because I knew there was something that you would probably be thrilled about as well. Elon Musk, who, has been the founder of Tesla. We've been seeing him doing all of this amazing work with SpaceX and his own flights. Elon Musk has just announced humanoid robots capable of doing menial tasks to be completed by 2022. And you can go and find this on the internet. The sad thing is, and I found it quite humorous, and I think he did too, but it made me a little cringe as well, is that they did show a model of what this humanoid might look like, but they also brought out an actor in a suit to dance for it, and it was a little creepy and maybe a little kitschy. But Matt, in seriousness, what do you think about this idea of like replacing people who are working, say, on mechanic shops with these humanoids? People are working on rocket ships with this humanoid, maybe even in your home washing the dishes. Do you think that that's something that we're going to start seeing in the very near future?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's my stock in trade, and the business that I'm involved in is robotics and autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, and they're not always exactly the same thing. We've all seen AI and demonstration with Watson, the computer that IBM put together and used in Jeopardy, which did a lot of data crunching to beat human opponents. So the question of how AI can best be used, I would summarize that the future is man-machine teaming, advanced teaming, where robotics and autonomous systems will do what they do best, and humans will be freed up to do what they do best. That machines will do the dull, dirty, dangerous, and mundane tasks so that we can go do other things that require more sophisticated inferential reasoning. And that's a good thing. You mentioned a couple of jobs that are out there that probably humans shouldn't be doing, but why should we have a 16-year-old standing next to a boiling vat of grease making your French fries? Is that really that necessary? We talk about demining in areas all over the world that have landmines. That's something best done by machines.
Right.
When we talk about driving and autonomous cars and autonomous trucks, maybe it's not a good idea to have a human being who's functioning on 4 hours sleep, driving all night to get you whatever you just ordered from Amazon. Maybe that's better done by machines. So all kinds of opportunities and uses for more sophisticated robots to do things that we shouldn't be doing anymore. And so a lot of what I do, both for commercial and government purposes, is looking at concepts of employment for where robots can be used and discussing what we should do with AI. Some of that's technological and some of it's ethical. Ethical AI is a big question. that we should probably talk about on this show more. What should we expect machines to do? And where are the problems with humanity that might cause problems with the machines? There are all kinds of things that we're debating now about the limits of lethality for AI, autonomous machines in combat. But there are also questions about accountability. Should an autonomous car crash into a crowd, who bears the responsibility? The owner of the car, the builder of the car, or the coder who wrote the programs? These are hard questions that we're in the middle of trying to solve right now.
Right. And that, what's interesting is that this is an ongoing conversation that the Vatican is having as well, but a lot of people aren't really paying attention to that because of all the scandals and all of the bad news that comes out. So I think it's really important for people to understand that if we can take a step back and look at the Vatican, it's not just, the politics or the scandals, but where we have a city state, and then we have a moral authority. And the moral authority has lasted for 2,000 years, and we know that the gates of hell will not prevail against it, right? But what does it mean when a gate prevails? It means it holds things in or keeps things out. And if Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, that means the church has got to storm the gates of hell. So I think your conversation on the morality of AI, I think that's where theologians and scientists really could do very well to kind of focus as we start moving forward in this. I mean, it looks like it's talk about agility. We're seeing this development of this technology at just a breathtaking place. Matt, you were talking about your work in both the DoD, which I know that we're not going to talk about, but or not talk too much about because a lot of that's super secret squirrel, as we say. But when it comes to what you're dealing with right now, we have this man, Elon Musk. He is really at the top of the totem pole when it comes to innovation right now. I mean, I heard the other day that he had come up with this idea for high-speed underground tunnel in order to use the speed of vacuum in order to move things from place to place robotically, underground, and keep the land looking pristine. I think that's brilliant. Why didn't we think about that? But Matt, how do you get to the level of other than just being a natural born genius? I mean, you've got kids right now who've grown up with the technology that they have. How are they getting to the point of thinking outside the box using robotics? I know that you have a program right now that you're launching. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that before we end our program today?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in those questions. So I'll start with the question of genius and thinking outside the box. I have a lot of respect for Elon Musk for his ability to push the boundaries of what if. There are some who view him with contempt because they think he's a charlatan and he's oversold things, but he's delivered on so many different things that I dismiss that question. I think he's a guy that pushes boundaries, and you're going to step on some toes when you do that. You're going to have some failures, some of them catastrophic, when you're trying to push the boundaries of technology. But he's delivered on some things that, were it not for someone like him, we probably wouldn't be where we are with space exploration and some of the other technologies exploring. So I'm not surprised that he would have someone walk out in a unitard to simulate a robot and push the idea of what if. That gets me to my point. We have to accept the fact that we are now preparing young students for a world that we're unfamiliar with. They're digital natives. They've grown up in this technology, and we're digital immigrants. We can remember a time when cell phones didn't exist. We can remember a time when AI and robotics was something you saw in a movie somewhere, and it was always something to be feared. But now these kids are growing up in an environment where their learning environment and their job environment is changing so quickly that if you're not asking the same questions once every 4 months, you're already behind the times, let alone once every 4 years. And so how do you prepare children to enter into a world where in 2012, the top 10 jobs didn't even exist back in 2004? Things change on a scale of once every 5 to 10 years, completely changing the economy and the hottest jobs. How do you prepare them for that if it's all technologically based? We've got to start early. And so a lot of schools out there are starting these STEM programs, these science, technology, engineering, and math programs. And some of them involve robotics. And one of the programs that we've introduced in a local private school that I'm working with is taking some of those autonomous robots where you can do coding and teaching them behaviors. And they have a resident autonomy on board and bringing those into the classroom, using as teaching tools, as instruments to get kids excited about STEM, to teach them coding without them knowing they're learning about coding at an earlier age, before high school, so that when they get to high school and they have these science programs as a part of their curriculum, they're prepared. And the idea is they can walk straight into jobs and maybe even go work for Elon Musk straight out of college, straight out of high school. That's the idea.
Right, and you know, Matt, we're getting ready to close, but I think people need to realize that here, my co-host here has a degree in military history again, and he also has a STEM degree in engineering, right? Systems engineering, and that those two are complementary. You know, it is something for people to understand that it is essential in our day and age to understand the classics, to be part of the great books curriculum, to really understand how to think. I mean, Jordan Peterson, who I've been listening to quite a bit, really just laments at the fact that people aren't reading as they should, you know, reading the classics, because it helps you to create and to think. So does STEM. And so encouraging your children to think outside the box, encouraging your children to embrace technology. This is essential. Matt, thank you again for joining me today. Thank you all for listening in on Intersections. Join us each week on Mondays. We look forward to having you and hosting you. But for now, God bless. Take care.
Thanks, Bree.